Hi, my name is Jourdain, and I am an addict.
Hi, Jourdain.
If you've checked out my first 2 episodes, or any of my other work somehow, then it should be no secret that I am a person in recovery from addiction. If you are unfamiliar with the lingo and terminology used in recovery circles, I apologize, because they will come up a bit, but I'll do my best to explain them. When I say I am a person in recovery from addiction, what that means is I used to be actively addicted to narcotics and other substances, namely opioids, and at a point I successfully quit using said substances. That point for me being March 22nd, 2017. I am over 5 years removed from the use of drugs. But I say that I am in recovery because I still deal with mental and emotional conditions brought on by the chemicals themselves and the lifestyle I led during use. Depending on the recovery model you might subscribe to, this recovery may last a few weeks to a few months to the rest of your life. This is something we will touch on a bit in this episode and probably expand upon a bit in an episode down the road. I think I can safely say that most of us are familiar with addiction in one form or another. Many of us have probably had addiction touch our lives, even if in a second or third-hand manner. However, what addiction is, and what it can be, the ways in which it manifests, can still be quite the mystery to the average person. I am of the belief that without first-hand experience, there is only so much a person can learn with an outside perspective. I would like to provide the best glimpse I can into this phenomenon, if only based on my personal experiences. I'll attempt to do this by breaking this presentation into a few distinct sections, outlining the content, and providing a little bit of insight based on what I've seen in myself and others dealing with addiction. Oh yeah. I'm Jourdain Edmondson.
Hi, Jourdain.
Hi, and this is See For Yourself. In this first section, we're going to be talking about addiction as a medical phenomenon. This is because, despite what some of you might have heard, addiction is not a moral failing. It is a health issue. This is especially true of drug and alcohol addiction, but also applies to things like gambling or sex addiction, which we will get into later. You may have already weighed in on this matter, discussing the popular topic of whether or not addiction is a disease. And though I can say with reasonable confidence that it does fit the definition, I am content with us agreeing that it is at least a medical and health matter. Evidence suggests that addiction in all of its forms directly affects our brain chemistry, even after the initial indulgence has worn off. Specifically, they tend to alter the parts of our brain that relate to reward systems and pleasure. Again, this is beyond the chemistry that is happening while you're under the influence of substances or engaging in high dopamine-inducing activity. These alterations happen in response to this. Depending on the substance and/or activity, it can take years after the fact to repair the damage done, and that's assuming you're taking active steps to mend the changes. Once these parts of the brain experience the repeated stimulation that a substance like opioids or high-grade stimulants, say, might produce, they start to adapt to these circumstances. These chemicals can alter brain function with only a few uses. I know this from my own experiences. Assuming we're all on board with the idea that our brain produces and processes chemicals that play a large part in our health and behavior, we can go on to assume that any drastic changes to this chemistry could result in a variety of adverse health and behavioral effects. When talking about addiction, it is good to remember that it's not only the pleasure functions that the brain is experiencing the stimulation of. Addictive chemicals and activities can change the production and processing of dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin, chemicals that affect our sense of happiness, well-being, contentment, and joy. But they can also affect norepinephrine, adrenaline, glutamate, various endorphins, and, forgive me, gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA. These brain chemicals serve a variety of functions, from regulating blood pressure to inducing sleep cycles to activating our fight or flight responses. All of these chemicals can be altered to a lesser extent, positively and negatively, by more mundane things: foods, physical activities, bonding with other people. Our brains and bodies are often conditioned by these things well before most of us ever try our first drug, sip of alcohol, or spin on the roulette wheel. It is usually thought that the specific ways in which you were conditioned would indicate whether or not you would have an immediate addictive reactions to these things upon first experience. If you had a lack of cohesive family as a child, some form of abuse or trauma, or just grew up in a certain neighborhood, it could be presumed that you would be more likely to have addiction-related tendencies. However, especially in the case of the contemporary opioid epidemic, we can see that is not always the case. Drug addiction has now made its way into Middle America, into the suburbs, into rural and isolated communities. You don't have to have experienced direct adversity or lived in a certain area to develop an addiction. The opportunity is everywhere. And that chemical response is absolute. We can reasonably predict what will happen when one chemical is introduced to another. We are unfortunately still a bit behind on the nature of these reactions in the long term, but the science is finally catching up. We can see clearly that a direct change in the function of the brain is caused nearly universally, given enough uses, be the number of those uses different for different people, of high-effect chemicals and activities. These changes constitute a medical and health condition. And don't get me wrong, there are absolutely both medical and societal conditions that indicate predisposition to addiction. A significant portion of addicts have gone through massive traumas that lead them towards substance abuse. An equal proportion report that they have parents and family members, sometimes going back generations, that were addicts. This is something we can again get into a bit later. Also, I do want to take a minute to point out here that you're rarely going to hear me use the term alcoholism or any substance-specific language like opioid abuse disorder. I'm also lumping in alcohol with other drugs and mentioning them alongside addictions or addictive activities like gambling and sex. This is because when I talk about addiction, I am casting a wide net, and this is for a purpose. In a clinical setting, it is often useful to isolate and categorize specific addictions for proper treatment. And from my own experiences, this seems to be a great idea. However, what I'm hoping to explain is the similarities across the board when it comes to addiction, and exactly why these similarities should affect the way we discuss addiction in all its forms. We will do this by talking about the practical mental and physical effects of addiction and how they relate to other disorders that alter behavior and brain chemistry. The Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous mentions one aspect of this in an interesting way: the ideas of mental obsession and phenomenon of craving. Despite having a lot of flaws, AA and its subsequent 12-step path does offer a lot of valuable insight. The flaws we will have to discuss at another time. For now, lay aside any potential prejudices you may have for AA, and let's look at this description a bit further. This mental obsession and/or phenomenon of craving expresses itself in a few ways that I think encompass most, if not all, forms of addiction, as well as some other seemingly unrelated mental illnesses. Focusing for a second on the word obsession, an idea or thought that continually intrudes on a person's mind. We can find the first common theme here. Once someone is addicted to something, obtaining or using that thing becomes an unshakable thought in their mind. From experience, it is like having an extension of your inner self that speaks to you more and more frequently. A passenger in your brain that wants to steer you in only one direction, that of your addiction. It can start out as a nagging thought or desire, reach that state of mind that comes with use. Given enough time, though, it becomes a legitimate obsession. It speaks more often and more loudly, chewing at you, begging you to get toward the object of your desire. Eventually, you can think of little else, even when the needs of your addiction have been met. These intrusive thoughts find their way into your dreams. I can remember falling asleep during my addiction, particularly when I didn't have my substance of choice, and dreaming repeatedly about acquiring and using it. These dreams were really nightmares, plagued by anxiety and longing. Interestingly enough, in not one of those hundreds of dreams did I ever succeed in actually using. I always woke up just before the fact. This particular aspect makes me think about addiction as similar to OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder. With OCD, sufferers are often plagued by similar intrusive thoughts. Only in these cases, it's usually related to some benign ritual, superstition, or process in their day. I realize I'm oversimplifying a bit, as is necessary, but I am aware there is more to it than that. For time, though, I want to highlight on these specific sorts of modes of obsession. The idea of intrusive or dark thoughts, a secondary voice in your head, urging you towards something that is either inconsequential or outright bad for you, lends itself to the descriptions of many other mental conditions as well. Depression and anxiety are among the most common. Harking back to OCD, though, there is another aspect of this condition specifically that also fits in with addiction, that being the compulsion. Spend any amount of time in a recovery environment and you will come across the phrase, used against my will, being employed to describe the compulsive nature of addiction. In some moments, that voice in your head is able to actually enter the driver's seat and cause you to act in a way that is out of your character. You may be fully aware of the damage a drug is doing to you, conscious of your own addiction, with a sincere desire to quit, and still find yourself using based out of compulsion. The same way OCD might cause one to develop rituals that satisfy the compulsion, addicts condition themselves into a ritual of accessing their chosen substance, using it, and enjoying the effects. The obsession itself will center around achieving these moments, whatever it may take for that to occur. When the opportunity arises, despite your better judgment, you will find yourself compulsively acting out the desires described in those intrusive thoughts. Now, I don't present this as a way to excuse myself or other addicts of the negative things we may have done in active addiction. I just want to relay the experience in a way that makes sense. I can't tell you how many days I woke up swearing to myself that I would not use that day, that I would suffer through the detox in my bed and come out the other side better off. And I almost always meant it. For the better part of my addiction, I wanted nothing more than to quit. But on virtually all of those days, I got out of the bed and I found a way to use. Be it the physical symptoms of withdrawal, the unshakable obsession and longing, or the compulsive autopilot that drove me blissfully unaware, back toward the drugs, it was incredibly difficult to eventually escape. While on the mental and physical effects, let's talk about that detox and withdrawal for a moment. I have heard repeated from concerned family members and well-meaning professionals alike that detox is simply a mental trick, that I wasn't actually feeling ill from the lack of drugs, that it was all in my head. This is, of course, complete bullshit. Nearly all addictive chemicals, including low-grade drugs like caffeine, cause some level of detox effect when you quit the substance. When your body and brain get used to receiving certain inputs, nutrients, and chemicals, it adjusts itself to compensate for the daily intake. With opiates, the levels of dopamine, serotonin, and certain endorphins skyrocket with each use. Eventually, your body thinks these levels are the norm. When, for whatever reason, the intake suddenly stops, your body is now unable to produce these chemicals naturally at a sufficient rate. So what happens when your brain is suddenly depleted of its crucial resources? It begins sending out distress signals, similar to the way it sends hunger pain to indicate you need to eat, except these signals indicate you need to use. Some of the main symptoms that come after quitting opiates suddenly include nausea, fever, diarrhea, body aches, specifically in the spine, headaches, restless limb syndrome, and insomnia. In short, it feels like you've got basically the worst flu of your life. With most opiate addicts, we experience this sickness several times a week, if not every day, right up until the moment we could use. With certain drugs, like alcohol and benzodiazepines, Xanax, Klonopin, and such, the physical symptoms of withdrawal can actually be fatal. These changes to the body, in this case the neurological system specifically, are so severe that the body can go into shock when deprived. This can cause convulsions, seizures, strokes, and heart attacks, all of which can lead to death. This is why, even in a rehab setting, professionals will usually wean addicts off of these drugs gradually instead of making them quit cold turkey. I think these examples begin to cover what is actually happening when a person is addicted, from their mental processes to their compulsive use to the symptoms of detox. The main symptoms of active addiction, the things that feed into it and allow it to sustain itself in one's body and mind. However, these aren't the only things to worry about when you are trying to recover from addiction. Once use has stopped, once you have made it safely through the detox, whether it took you a few days or a few weeks, there are still challenges ahead. Firstly, that obsession is strong. It is an active part of your personality now, and it isn't going to just go away. Untreated, that obsession can drive you to use even once the physical symptoms of withdrawal are gone. I've been weeks and months sober in the slow but seemingly successful process of fixing the things I had messed up in addiction and have ended up using for no apparent reason, at least not to an outside observer anyway. Internally, though, I know I had been obsessing about using for those weeks and months. It's a lot like depression and anxiety in this way as well, in that your circumstances don't need to be depressing or stressful to necessarily induce symptoms. There's just that voice inside your head telling you there is something to worry about, and oftentimes it wins. The compulsion to use is interesting because it is both mental and physical. The actual process is taking place, the firing of the neurons, the trading of chemicals. It's happening in the brain. It's causing you to have thoughts that lead to compulsive behavior, though. When that passenger takes the wheel, sometimes it feels like you're just watching your own actions from the back of your head. Your body seems to just do things on its own. Now at this point, you might be thinking something to the effect of, sure, that's what happens once you actually get addicted to something. But they still chose to do the thing in the first place, so they knew the consequences and it's their own fault. Beep beep, blah blah, it's not a disease. And whatever. That's a fine point. Except taking a risk that can result in adverse effects has no bearing on what is and isn't a disease. To that end, lung cancer in the case of smokers isn't a disease because they knew the risks of smoking. Heart disease from smoking or poor diet isn't heart disease. You get what I mean. That being said, does an addict bear some responsibility for picking up in the first place? I would say that in a lot of cases, yeah. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to completely divorce a person of responsibility for their actions, especially if the actions hurt others. I do think that it's important to look at what addiction does to a person and how that causes them to act unethically. And further, that we should look at what both biology and society do that results in the prevalence of addiction in the first place. It has long been understood that there are genetic, hereditary properties relating to addiction. Many researchers believe that as much as half, if not more, of a person's susceptibility to addiction can be linked to genetic markers. Further, it is indicated that if you have at least one immediate family member who has suffered from addiction, you are 50% more likely to endure the same affliction, given that you partake in the substance or activity in the first place. However, we can be born with the markers for addiction, even if our families don't carry them in their genes. The same neurological structures, chemical processes, and hormonal pathways that are indicative of those prone to addiction can often show up randomly, just like other illnesses and diseases. Though family medical history and genetics provide plenty of predictive models, medical maladies can and do strike randomly. There are untold numbers of addicts who grew up with no indication that they should avoid addictive substances, activities, or behaviors. Addiction didn't run in their families. They didn't suffer from other mental illnesses. Maybe they had tried other things that were equally addictive but were able to quit easily. At least that's how it seemed to them. So why did they end up as addicts? Well, as far as underlying causes go, we would do well to remember that genetics aren't the only variable. Research also indicates that the environment you grow up in can point to one's likelihood of suffering addiction. Though the initial findings were those we might expect, outcomes based on income levels, having both parents in a home, a good education, more recent studies find it to be a bit more nuanced than that. The standards in these models are based around different questions. Did the person have a high level of emotional engagement growing up? Were they educated on addiction or merely on abstinence from drugs altogether? Do they feel connected to the people around them? Do they feel valued in their families, friendships, and communities? There is a now famous study on addiction referred to simply as Rat Park. In this series of experiments, scientists essentially placed a bunch of rats in some cages and set up 2 water bottles in each cage, one containing regular water, the other water laced with morphine. Initially, the rats would congregate, play around, do rat stuff, sticking mostly to the regular water. They would try the morphine, seem dissatisfied, and go back to drinking the regular water. After a few weeks, however, the rats started going for the morphine more and more often. Eventually, as we might expect at this point, the rats become fully addicted. They no longer cared about the normal water, food, or doing rat things with each other. They only wanted more morphine. These results really only showed what we already know, that morphine is addictive and that if anyone ingests it constant enough, they will suffer from addiction. And so the researchers weren't quite satisfied with this answer. Soon, they began to wonder, what if the reason the rats become so obsessed with the morphine is because they simply have nothing else to interact with? After all, they were in relatively small groups, locked inside bare, metal cages. At this thought, they began to construct Rat Park. This was essentially one of those giant hamster cages with all sorts of tunnels and wheels and things for little rodents to play on. They let them interact in larger groups and gave them better food, basically creating an absolute paradise for the rats. And wouldn't you know it, almost none of the rats ever got addicted to the morphine. There would still be the occasional user coming over for a modest sip, usually immediately rushing back to the regular water and not touching the morphine again after. Though these findings were only found in lab rats, as a human version of Rat Park would equate to building some sort of utopian city, I think they provide a useful lens with which we can view the subject. When you speak to addicts, you will often hear them talk about feeling like they never belonged, almost as if they were constantly in a hostile and unfamiliar environment, with no engagement in and from anything other than drugs. The biggest issue with these two major contributors, genetics and environment, is that they can actually compound. Often, people will have both genetic and sociological markers for addiction. I would venture to say that regardless of our family and home life, a large majority of us can spot these social markers in our own life. Unfulfilling job, poor luck dating, superficial friendships. Many of us walk around in what already feels like a bare metal cage. It is no wonder addiction has become more prevalent in recent years, even among those who showed no tendencies before. Now that we've kind of established what addiction is on a fundamental level and what can cause it, let's discuss what it looks like practically in everyday life. As we discussed before, addictive behaviors can show themselves initially as symptoms of other, more active health issues, such as anxiety, depression, and OCD. The ritualization of certain activities, codependency, and thrill-seeking are all addictive behaviors. Constant desire for approval, feelings of detachment, and apathy are all symptoms of susceptibility. These things might lead us to more acceptable or at least accessible addictions. Caffeine, nicotine, gambling, sex, pornography, junk food, and most notably alcohol, the majority of these being seen as socially acceptable or able to be consumed without immediate risk of addiction. After all, who hasn't tried a beer, a coffee, a lottery ticket? I suppose it goes without saying at this point that alcohol, at least when it comes to the chemical functions of addiction, is on par with most narcotics. Its effects on cognition and the body, its habit-forming nature, and the severity of both addiction and withdrawal symptoms place it alongside drugs like Xanax, Percocet, and Adderall. Perhaps not quite as severe as heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamine, but quite potent nonetheless, yet accessible, acceptable. Interestingly enough, the aforementioned addictive activities do a fair enough job of creating the same chemical responses in the brain as drugs. The rush one receives from gambling, whether it's high-stakes poker or a $1 scratch-off, is tantamount to the high of some pretty potent substances. In constant anticipation, desire to win, and fear of loss, your brain is compensating for these fluctuating emotions by firing on all cylinders, altering its production of chemicals in the same way it does when it receives stimulation from ingested substances. The same goes with sex, pornography, or masturbation, except in these cases, your body is hardwired to produce a flood of dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin, both during arousal and during climax. Excessive stimulation in this manner can result in the same long-term effects on the brain as active drug addiction. Your brain has a hard time keeping up with the demand for this stimulation, forcing you to obsess about getting to the object of your addiction. And there are, of course, the highly addictive chemicals found in food, soda, tobacco, energy drinks, and other easily accessible products. Again, creating nearly indistinguishable reactions in your brain from those produced by drugs. Clearly, the chance to become addicted is everywhere for almost anybody. How does it start, though? You have that innocuous first experience. You try a delicious food, take that first sip of alcohol, go to your first casino. It feels good, so naturally you want to try it again. With your harder drugs, most of us know to an extent that this is a bad idea. The thing is, it rarely starts with a harder drug. If the habits develop, eventually we need to move on to the next thing. We need to, at all cost, reproduce those feelings that we felt the first time. Because often, it wasn't just our first time feeling a little buzzed, having an orgasm, or experiencing that wave of numbness roll over our bodies. It was our first time feeling whole, feeling engaged. Even when we don't realize it, many of us walk around just a few careless choices away from igniting that same fire. If you're anything like me, you have probably experienced emotions that you didn't know how to describe, pushing you towards a desire that you couldn't name. I think, in a way, we're all looking for some sort of connection to ourselves, others, or something else altogether. Some people search in religion, others in social interaction, and others don't even know where to begin looking. I fell into this third class, I think, and when I did eventually start to blindly stumble, reaching around in the dark, my hand found a needle. Luckily, I made it out fine, but I was, well, lucky. Luckier than most. Whether we want to believe it or not, addiction is something that could happen to almost any of us. Just take a look at the amount of addicts who got their start on a prescription from their doctor. All it took was the drug itself. It didn't matter who the people were. At least a quarter of the people I've been in rehabs with didn't use a single drug until they were in their 40s and prescribed painkillers. At least all the alcoholics I know got their start by drinking a beer. Something around 70% of people do at least once a year with no issues. Addictions can manifest in different forms with different degrees, tendencies, substances, and activities. It can develop across all ages, nations, races, genders, and classes. It is a public health issue that, if it hasn't yet, will bear on all people eventually. Even with understanding that addiction is primarily a health issue, not a moral one, the subject is still wrought with many moral and ethical issues. These issues are multivariant, from the dilemmas addicts face during their active use, to the scientific and medical approach to treatment, to the societal and legal consequences of addiction even existing as a phenomenon. The first question we might ask relating to this would be whether or not an addict acted unethically by indulging in an addictive substance in the first place? Oddly enough, this answer seems to depend on the substance used. If it is alcohol, chances are most people will agree that a slide into addiction isn't necessarily the fault of the addict. They just did what everyone else was doing. They learned the hard way that they cannot drink normally. If the substance is heroin, or cigarettes even, people's opinions seem to differ a bit. We assume that the dangers of these chemicals are so well and widely known that you made an ethical mistake by indulging in that first time. And though the drug is nearly indistinguishable from heroin, if you became addicted to, say, OxyContin, especially in the way of legitimate prescription in the early 2000s, the opinion shifts yet again. Recent research shows that while the pharmaceutical industry knew the disastrous effects of this drug, they hid it from the doctors and patients alike. Therefore, people can understand becoming accidentally addicted. It seems the moral question on first use seems to fall into a gray area, and for good reason. There is no definitive wrong or right when it comes to use. Again, it is something that could happen to most anyone, given the right circumstances. We have, of course, touched a bit on what addiction does to you psychologically, how it affects your personality. I think it then fair to touch on a major part of your personality that changes, your individual code of ethics. Whether it comes from religion, family upbringing, social standards, life philosophy, in everyone exists a relatively unique moral code. Though most aspects of this are seemingly universal, don't murder, don't lie, cheat, steal, they are also malleable. Many people can admit that under certain circumstances, to save a life for example, it is perfectly permissible to do these very things. Addiction does a surprisingly good job of convincing our subconscious that we do, in fact, need to break our own codes to survive. Again, this is not an attempt to defend the negative actions of addicts. I'm merely trying to describe what is going on inside the mind, literally and figuratively, of a person in active addiction. Remember how we discussed earlier the pain signals your brain sends your body when you are hungry? Well, when you are in addiction, your brain begins to send the exact same signals, but out of hunger for your substance of choice. The human brain literally tricks itself into thinking the drug is as necessary for survival as food and water. Essentially, it's causing reactions in your body and within itself, causing movements and actions that push you toward use at all cost. Think of the common moral dilemma. Is it okay to steal food to feed your family? Outside of extreme capitalistic hog riding, most people would agree that yes, in this circumstance, the theft is morally justified. Of course, it helps if the food being stolen is not needed by the person it's being stolen from, but you get the point. What is happening to this hypothetically hungry person on a fundamental level is their brain sending signals that they need to compromise their code of ethics and obtain food for themselves and their family at all cost. This process is very much similar to what is happening to an addict experiencing an intense desire to acquire and use their drug. While this information, again, doesn't remove responsibility from an addict doing unethical things during addiction, it does begin to throw some doubt on the idea that addicts are inherently unethical. After all, the hungry person likely won't continue to steal if their needs are met. I would argue, neither would an addict. This brings us to another moral issue surrounding addiction, that of how we approach it medically and socially. These two fields are sort of intertwined at the moment, given how the American legal system takes precedent over the medical system. We haven't yet caught up to the scientific consensus on how to deal with things, addiction included. As of now, we still treat addiction criminally. A large portion of highly addictive substances and activities are either banned outright or heavily regulated, their uses still seen as a moral failing, and likewise, a criminal offense. Until we lay this mindset aside, I believe we are at a collective moral failing, to ourselves and to each other. The real ethical issue we are facing is how to provide the best resources and treatment to those affected by addiction, while still limiting the availability of addictive products, especially to those most vulnerable. It is a fair argument that people should have the right to decide for themselves what they want to consume, and I do think this is true, given that they have the proper education on what they are consuming and what the effects will be. However, they should also have the right to stop when they want, and ethically the right resources to do so. The war on drugs was a failure. Drugs won. The residual contemporary drug policies are of equal failure. The resources for addicts and their families are laughable, and the availability of highly addictive drugs in all communities has skyrocketed despite heightened police action against such activities. We are currently failing morally when it comes to addiction. The obvious path forward would be something that includes rolling back criminalization of certain drug-related offenses which only serve to heighten the symptoms of addiction and replace them with viable treatment options. Fund research and implementation of new treatments. Offer more clinical resources to those suffering. Despite what you may hear, most addicts will eventually quit. However, they have to live through their addiction before they can do so. For myself, this was about 10 years. For others, it could be longer, but everyone deserves the chance. Some end up quitting because they get put in prison for a long time, or suffer health consequences that make using impossible. A lot of us simply reach some sort of breaking point and fight like hell to make it out. Nearly every addict has somewhere inside them, even if they can't express it yet, a desire to quit. Unfortunately, most of them never have that desire met with opportunity. In 2020, there were 91,000 overdose deaths in the US alone, a 31% increase from the previous year. 91,000 human beings who suffered from a treatable illness, erased forever. A moral dilemma indeed. There is, thankfully, some good news. Not only is recovery possible, it is likely, given the right circumstances. If an addict is at the point in their addiction where they have a sincere desire to quit, if they can properly isolate themselves from outside stresses, if they can stomach their way through detox, and if the proper aftercare is applied, they can begin to recover. Recovery isn't easy, and abstaining from use alone will not solve the underlying issues that led to addiction. Even if you make it through detox, go through rehab, go to recovery meetings, you may still have to start over. Some folks like to say, get that first one out of the way, or relapse is part of recovery, and that can be true, but it doesn't have to be. It's important to remember that resurgence happens with a lot of illnesses, and it does not constitute a failure in treatment. Addiction is strong. It is, like a lot of diseases and viruses, seemingly built to thrive in humans. We have to be equally strong and twice as smart to fight it. When it comes to recovery paths, you should be happy to know that there is no shortage of options. We talked a bit earlier about Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step philosophy, and though this is the most common, easily accessible, and arguably successful treatment model, it is not the only one. This is good because AA seems to turn off a lot of people, and I've seen a lot of people abandon recovery entirely just because they didn't get down with what AA had to offer. I could talk a lot about why this is, but I think I'll save that for a future episode. Luckily, if the meeting and fellowship thing feels okay, but you just don't like AA's literature and philosophy, there are many variants to choose from. There are literally hundreds of programs that borrow heavily from AA without directly emulating its more dogmatic principles. Narcotics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, and Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, or SLAA, are all examples of this that cater to specific addictions. There are also things like Celebrate Recovery and Narcanon, which offer a step work and meeting structure, though with less steps and influenced by Christianity and Scientology, respectively. You can also find autonomous recovery support groups with varying principles and techniques virtually everywhere with a little digging online. If the group support and experience structure doesn't appeal, there are countless therapists and other medical professionals offering personalized treatment plans, most of which can be found through your insurance. I do have to take an obligatory moment here to mention how insurance is a scam and is actually one of the largest barriers between sufferers of illness and treatment in general, and addiction is just one condition on a long list. That being said, many states do offer free treatment and rehab centers, though they are usually plagued by ungodly long wait lists. The main point I want to make here is that recovery is possible. I am proof of this. In fact, myself and two of my closest friends have been sober for 5, 6, and 7 years respectively. I've known them since we were children, we grew up, went through addiction together, and we all were able to get sober. Addiction is an illness, but it is treatable. It is survivable. Being an addict doesn't make you a bad person, a criminal, or unsalvageable. It just means you have a long journey ahead of you. I can promise, though, it gets easier as time goes, and it's beautiful on the other side. If you or someone you know is suffering from addiction, get professional help as soon as possible. If you are in the U.S., you can call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA helpline at 1-800-662-4357, 24 hours a day. That's 1-800-662-HELP. This line can provide treatment resources, rehab locations, referrals, and information on support groups and community organizations. Many U.S. states also offer local resources on their state government websites and through local offices of the Department of Health and Human Services. If you have private insurance or Medicaid, addiction treatment is often covered by your provider. You can connect with them for rehabs and other treatment facilities in their network. Nearly every town in America has an AA or NA meeting, the schedules of which can always be found online. There is also replacement therapy with drugs like methadone and Suboxone, which offer a safer and legal route to use from the standpoint of harm reduction. Also available are reception blocking drugs like naltrexone or Vivitrol, which are taken via injection monthly and inhibit you from experiencing the effects of certain substances. The most important first step toward any of these treatment options is to reach out to someone. anyone for help with your addiction. Be honest about what you're doing, how much, and how it's affecting you. Make sure it's someone you can trust, whether that's your doctor or a family member or a friend, and ask them to assist you by keeping you accountable to your goal. If you are lucky, they will help you get the eventual treatment you need. Apart from this, you do have to actively participate in your recovery. Initially, this means actually going to treatment or rehab. After, though, you have to be conscious in examining your behavior, thoughts, and actions. You will have to learn yourself on an intimate level as to be able to accurately judge your recovery process. No one else will do this for you. No one can convince you to be honest, to reflect, or to assess. This responsibility will be completely yours. If you make an honest attempt, however, I think you'll be surprised at how quickly others will notice and begin to assist however they can. There are a few things I touched on in this episode that I plan on returning to with more attention in the future. My own experiences with addiction, the path I took to recovery, my thoughts and philosophies on the matter, maybe even a whole episode on AA and the 12 steps, given there is a lot to discuss and dissect there. If any of this interests you or you have any other questions, let me know. I said near the beginning that there is only so much you can learn about addiction without actually experiencing it firsthand. I hope I was able to portray it enough to provide some understanding, because in this case, I think learning from someone else might be for the best. Otherwise, you would just have to go out and see for yourself.